The United States sells weapons to Taiwan. It says Taiwan must not be taken by force. But there is one thing the US refuses to do: support Taiwanese independence. In 2021, the White House deleted a tweet over a single emoji, not because it was wrong, but because it could be interpreted as a shift in US policy. One symbol was enough to raise concerns about a military reaction from China. That alone tells us how fragile this issue really is. So, here's the central question. If Taiwan is a democracy of 23 million people, openly threatened with war, why won't the United States support its independence? The answer isn't about values. It's about the cost the US believes it would have to pay. To understand why the United States does not support Taiwanese independence today, we have to start with a fact that is a critical turning point. Washington was willing to let Taiwan fall. In 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China, bringing the Chinese Civil War to a decisive close. The defeated nationalist government fled to Taiwan, and Mao openly described the island's liberation as unfinished business. At that moment, the United States showed little inclination to intervene. President Harry Truman stated publicly that America would not step in if the mainland moved against Taiwan. The island was not seen as a democratic cause. Taiwan was under authoritarian rule, nor as a vital strategic interest. To Washington, it was the unresolved aftermath of a civil war the US preferred to leave behind. That view shifted abruptly in 1950, not because Taiwan changed, but because the international system did. When the Korean War erupted, US leaders feared a chain reaction across East Asia. Taiwan was suddenly reinterpreted, not as a leftover problem, but as a strategic pivot. It lay at the heart of what American planners called the First Island Chain, a defensive arc stretching from Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines. If Taiwan fell, the Western Pacific would be exposed, and US positions in Asia would be far harder to defend. From that point, US policy hardened. In 1954, Washington signed a mutual defense treaty with Taipei, pledging to protect the island. But the reason for that commitment matters. The United States was not defending Taiwan because it embodied democratic values. It did not. Taiwan was under martial law. The motivation was strategic, not moral. Taiwan functioned as a forward outpost in the Cold War, a barrier against both Beijing and Moscow at a time when the Soviet bloc appeared ascendant. For the next quarter century, the United States shielded Taiwan not as an end in itself, but as a means to a larger objective: preventing communist dominance in Asia. That distinction is crucial. From the very beginning, Taiwan was treated less as a nation whose future would be settled on principle and more as a strategic asset whose status had to be carefully managed. And that logic, strategy first, principle second, never truly disappeared. By the late 1970s, the United States faced a strategic recalculation. China was no longer the primary concern. The greater threat was the Soviet Union, whose military spending had surged past $200 billion in today's dollars, and whose influence stretched from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia. To counter Moscow, Washington needed a working relationship with Beijing. Taiwan, once again, became secondary. In 1979, the US formally recognized the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China. This is often described as a clean break with Taiwan. In reality, it was anything but. The recognition was carefully engineered to avoid answering the most dangerous question: what exactly is China? The agreement named a government, not borders, and that omission was intentional. The wording on Taiwan was even more precise. The US stated that it acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. In diplomatic terms, acknowledge means recognition of existence, not validity. It is the difference between saying, "we hear you," and "we agree with you." US officials repeatedly clarified this distinction internally. Congressional records from the period show that lawmakers were assured the US had not recognized Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan, nor agreed to unification, nor renounced future involvement. This linguistic ambiguity served two strategic purposes. For Beijing, normalization was sold domestically as a triumph. Chinese state media framed it as proof that even the United States now accepted the PRC's legitimacy and Taiwan's eventual return. But that narrative strengthened the Communist Party at home during a fragile post-cultural revolution period. For Washington, the same documents preserved maximum flexibility. U.S. officials could point to the text and say, accurately, that no promises had been made on Taiwan's final status. In fact, within months of recognition, Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act, reaffirming arms sales and security cooperation. Far from abandoning Taiwan, the U.S. quietly institutionalized its continued involvement. What emerged was not a resolution, but a balance of convenient fictions. China accepted ambiguity because it believed economic growth and military modernization would eventually force unification on its terms. The U.S. accepted ambiguity because it avoided a binary choice between war with a nuclear power or a humiliating retreat from Asia. This was not diplomatic confusion. It was a calculated postponement, a framework stable enough to prevent immediate conflict, yet fragile enough that every word, every gesture, and decades later, even a single emoji could be interpreted as a signal. The structure built in 1979 still defines the limits of American policy and explains why clarity, to this day, is treated as a liability rather than a virtue. This is one of the most persistent misunderstandings in American discussions about Taiwan. The phrase "one China" sounds definitive, but it actually refers to two fundamentally different positions. The one China principle is Beijing's claim. It states that Taiwan is an inseparable part of the People's Republic of China, and that the PRC holds full sovereignty over the island. This position is written into Chinese law and described by Beijing as a non-negotiable red line, one it has repeatedly said could justify the use of force. The United States does not accept this principle. Instead, Washington follows its own one China policy, which is narrower and more cautious. Under this policy, the U.S. does not recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation and does not maintain formal diplomatic relations. But just as importantly, the U.S. also does not recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. In more than 40 years of official statements, Washington has never said that Taiwan legally belongs to the PRC. This distinction is not theoretical. Since 1979, every major U.S.-China communique uses the same wording. The U.S. acknowledges the Chinese position on Taiwan without endorsing it. In diplomatic terms, that means awareness, not agreement. Congressional testimony from the late 1970s and early 1980s makes this explicit. U.S. officials repeatedly assured lawmakers that normalization with Beijing did not settle Taiwan's status. This is why accusations from Beijing that the U.S. is violating the one China principle are misleading. The United States never promised to follow that principle in the first place. All what it pledged was more limited, to avoid recognizing Taiwan as an independent country and to refrain from promoting a two Chinas outcome. That legal and linguistic space allows the U.S. to do something unusual: oppose any forced change to Taiwan's status, sell it defensive weapons, over $70 billion since 1979, and maintain deep unofficial ties, all without contradicting its recognition of Beijing. In short, the U.S. position is not neutral, but it is deliberately incomplete. Washington takes a clear stance against coercion, while refusing to take a stance on sovereignty. That unresolved gap is not a flaw, it is the foundation of American policy. When the United States normalized relations with Beijing in 1979, it faced immediate resistance at home. Congress was unwilling to sever security ties with Taiwan outright. The compromise was the Taiwan Relations Act, a law designed to preserve Taiwan's security while avoiding a formal defense guarantee. The act commits the U.S. to providing Taiwan with defensive weapons and to maintaining the capacity to resist coercion against the island. But it stops short of promising military intervention. There is no automatic defense clause. Instead, the law states that the president must inform Congress of any threat and take appropriate action. What that action entails is intentionally left undefined. This ambiguity is the core of the strategy. the U.S. arms Taiwan to raise the cost of invasion, but avoids binding itself to war. Analysts often describe this as armed ambiguity, deterrence without commitment. China is left uncertain whether an attack would trigger U.S. intervention, while Taiwan is warned that American support has limits. The scale of this approach is visible in the numbers. Since 1979, the U.S. has approved more than $70 billion in arms sales to Taiwan, including air defenses and anti-ship missiles. Taiwan spends roughly 2.5% of its GDP on defense. At the same time, the People's Liberation Army has positioned over 2,000 missiles within range of the island, many designed for rapid saturation attacks. From Washington's perspective, clarity would be dangerous. A firm guarantee could embolden Taipei to declare independence, while a clear refusal to intervene could invite Beijing to strike. The Taiwan Relations Act avoids both. It does not solve the Taiwan issue. It freezes it, using uncertainty as a tool to keep the peace. From the outside, Taiwan is often portrayed as a society on the brink of declaring independence, just waiting for U.S. backing. Inside Taiwan, the picture looks very different. For more than 2 decades, public opinion has been remarkably stable. Surveys conducted regularly since the late 1990s show that roughly 80 to 90% of Taiwanese voters prefer maintaining the status quo, some indefinitely, others while postponing a final decision. By contrast, fewer than 10% consistently support declaring independence immediately, and a similarly small share favors rapid unification with China. These numbers have held across crises, elections, and leadership changes. This is why Taiwan is not Ukraine. There is no overwhelming public mandate for an immediate, irreversible break. That caution is deeply rational. The polling shows that when respondents are asked whether they would still support independence if it meant war, support drops sharply. The trade-off is understood. Independence is not seen as a symbolic act. It is seen as a trigger. Taiwan's internal politics reflect this reality. The Kuomintang, often labeled pro-China, argues that economic interdependence reduces risk. China absorbs nearly 40% of Taiwan's exports, a level of exposure the KMT views as leverage to preserve peace. To them, stability is strategic, not ideological. On the other side, the Democratic Progressive Party emphasizes a distinct Taiwanese identity and skepticism toward Beijing. Yet even the DPP avoids a formal declaration of independence. Its leaders argue that Taiwan is already functionally sovereign and therefore has nothing to gain and everything to lose from forcing a legal break. The shared assumption across parties is blunt. A declaration of independence would almost certainly mean war. Beijing has said as much, repeatedly and publicly. Taiwanese voters, regardless of identity, understand the risk. That is why most choose ambiguity over affirmation, delay over decision. This matters enormously for U.S. policy. Washington is not restraining a restless population eager to declare independence. It is aligning with a society that, for now, prefers survival over symbolism. The status quo persists not because Taiwan lacks identity, but because it understands the cost of naming it too clearly. At first glance, the American position sounds evasive, even hypocritical. But in the Taiwan Strait, clarity is not stabilizing. It is dangerous. A public U.S. endorsement of Taiwanese independence would immediately give Beijing what it has spent decades preparing for: a clear political and legal justification for war. China's anti-secession law explicitly authorizes the use of non-peaceful means if independence becomes irreversible. This is not symbolic language. It is the legal framework the Chinese leadership would rely on to mobilize public opinion and legitimize military action. For the United States, the consequences would be immediate and severe. Next, an explicit endorsement would collapse strategic ambiguity into a binary choice: either intervene militarily against a nuclear-armed power or stand aside and suffer a profound loss of credibility. That credibility underpins U.S. security commitments to over 30 formal allies, from NATO to Japan and South Korea. A failure to act after drawing a clear red line in Taiwan would ripple far beyond East Asia, reshaping how allies calculate American resolve. The military balance makes this even riskier. The People's Liberation Army has deployed more than 2,000 ballistic and cruise missiles within range of Taiwan, alongside rapidly expanding air and naval forces optimized for a fast, high-intensity opening strike. U.S. wargaming consistently shows that decisions in a Taiwan crisis would need to be made in hours or days, not weeks. In that environment, diplomatic signals are operational signals. This is why Washington chooses process over outcome. The U.S. refuses to decide what Taiwan should ultimately be, but it is uncompromising about how change can occur. No party is allowed to alter the status quo by force. No unilateral trigger, neither an invasion from Beijing nor a declaration from Taipei, should make war inevitable. This posture denies China certainty while also denying Taiwan a blank check. That is the logic behind the phrase, "We do not support independence." It removes the clearest casus belli without endorsing coercion. It aligns with Taiwanese public opinion, where around 80 to 90% consistently favor maintaining the status quo, and it preserves deterrence by keeping Beijing unsure of the U.S. response. In essence, the United States is not defending independence. It is defending time. Time to prevent miscalculation, time for deterrence to function, and time to keep peaceful outcomes, however distant, from disappearing. The cost of that strategy is permanent ambiguity. The benefit so far has been the absence of war. For 4 decades, the Taiwan Strait has been held together by delay. But delay is not stasis, and time is not neutral. Every year that passes shifts the balance, socially in Taiwan, militarily in China, and politically in the United States. In Taiwan, the most powerful change is generational. Surveys tracking identity since the 1990s show a steady rise in people identifying as Taiwanese only, now exceeding 60% overall and reaching 70 to 80% among those under 30. Events like the 2014 Sunflower Movement hardened skepticism toward Beijing, while developments in Hong Kong reinforce the belief that promised autonomy can be reversed. This does not translate into immediate calls for independence, but it does mean the emotional and cultural distance from China is widening with time. Across the strait, Trung Quoc is betting on power. Thus, its economy has grown to roughly $18 trillion, and its military modernization has been relentless. Defense spending has increased for decades, naval tonnage now rivals the U.S. Navy in the region, and precision strike capabilities continue to expand. From Beijing's perspective, patience is strategic. The longer it waits, the stronger it becomes, and the more daunting intervention appears. Meanwhile, the United States faces its own constraints. Public support for acting as the world's police has declined steadily since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Polls show majorities favor prioritizing domestic challenges over overseas commitments. Washington still has unmatched power, but less appetite to use it. Strategic ambiguity buys time, but it also depends on credibility, and credibility depends on political will. So, the status quo persists, and not because it is stable, but because every alternative looks worse. Taiwan grows more distinct. China grows more capable. The U.S. grows more cautious. Each side believes time favors it, yet time is pushing them toward a narrowing corridor where miscalculation becomes more likely. That leaves the central, unresolved question, one with no easy answer and no neutral clock. As time moves forward, who is actually betting on the right future? For decades, U.S. policy toward Taiwan has been misunderstood as weakness, hypocrisy, or moral failure. In reality, it is none of those. It is not pure idealism, and it is not a betrayal of democracy. It is an attempt to manage a problem with no safe solution, where every clear answer risks catastrophe. By refusing to endorse independence and refusing to accept coercion, the United States has chosen delay over decision, restraint over resolution. And sometimes, in a world of nuclear powers and irreversible wars, the only way to keep the peace is to stay deliberately unclear about where you stand. If this video helped you see that complexity more clearly, like, subscribe, and join us for more explanations that go beyond headlines and slogans.